It sounds like this is going to be quite the process. How's it going to work? What else do we know about the requirements that we'll need to face as air travellers?
Look, the requirements are getting greater and greater all the time, and depending on where you go, they vary considerably. And there is a map that you can go to have a look at all of this. It's the IATA COVID travel map, and you run your cursor over each different country, and a little balloon opens up with lots and lots of instructions. And so the requirements, as I said, vary. For instance, if you're going to the United Kingdom, you've got one test before you leave, and then you've got a test before you come back, and 2 tests back in Australia. But if you're going to Singapore, when they open up with us, you're going to have a test before you leave. You're going to have 3 tests on arrival, one day 2, one day 6, then a test to come back, then 2 tests on arrival back in Australia with quarantine. Each test costs you $150. So it could be that on a short journey, the testing cost could be more than the actual airfare.
Whereas in the United States, I interviewed a guest last week and he said he turned up, no temperature checks, didn't have to show proof of vaccination. Masks there are the big thing. There seems to be a bit of air rage going on about having to wear masks on planes in the US in particular.
Well, talking of the US, more people died in Florida last week than have died in Australia since the pandemic. So there's some very, very different scenarios around the world as to where they're treating this. And yes, the wearing of masks has become a huge issue in the United States. Air rage has soared, thousands and thousands of cases, massive fines, and now the airlines are talking about having a global banned list. So at the moment, airlines have their own list, and not too many share those lists. What they're talking about now is having a global banned list. So if you play up on Delta Airlines in America, you won't get on board Qantas going to Australia because you've played up. So hopefully that will be an impediment to people misbehaving when it comes to masks.
And masks, well, I was interested to see some new research published just in the past 24 hours talking about why masks on planes are so important. There's new data out showing just where the risky spots are in terms of plane travel. And it seems to be when you've got your mask on, you're doing well, but it's when you take it off for mealtime, that's when your risk really soars.
Look, it does. It increases by approximately 70%. Now, a lot of this data, though, has been assembled in the United States, in Europe and whatnot, where having a COVID test is not required, being vaccinated is not required. Now, so if you're getting on board Qantas, for instance, in Sydney and going to London in November, you're going to have a COVID test before you leave, you're going to be fully vaccinated. So the chances of transmission on board that flight are probably 0, like they are in Western Australia, where there's no transmission at all because there's no COVID. So we have to be careful about the analysis of those details. But certainly in a domestic US environment, keep your mask on.
And vaccination certificates, I've talked about this with you before, it's quite a fraught area in terms of how this is going to work.
That's a lovely phrase, fraught.
I saw one report suggesting we could be having to turn up for an international flight 8 hours before we're getting on the plane. That seems extraordinary.
Well, certainly at the moment, when it's all paper, vaccination certificate, and it's all paper processing, yes, there's long delays depending on the various circumstances. That's all being digitised. There's a government app out, VDSNC, which is available for download. That's where you're going to have your vaccine passport and your test. There's also the IATA travel app, which airlines around the world are rolling out. But the other issue, as well as all of that digitisation and apps, when you get to a country, you've got to download their local tracking app so they can track you. So, when you're travelling to multiple countries, you could find yourself with about 6 apps or 7 apps, depending on where you're going, to comply with local regulations.
And with all of this, there's a quarantine aspect as well. I interviewed the CEO of Intrepid Travel last week, and he said to me, the one big barrier for us is quarantine, because as long as you've got that quarantine system in place, it's such a deterrent for people to get on planes knowing they're going to have to quarantine when they get home.
Yep.
In terms of that quarantine situation, I mean, when we're looking at places where we don't have to quarantine from, we're still looking at travel bubbles for some time.
Look, we are. New Zealand obviously is going to be a very popular destination. Now, Singapore, what they do there, which is really interesting, is you COVID test before you leave. You've got to be double vaccinated. COVID test on arrival. You have to then go to a hotel with a mask. You've got to wear a mask in Singapore, regardless. And then within 24 hours, they'll text you to tell you that you're free to get out and go around, but you still have to have another test on day 2, another test on day 6. So different countries have different scenarios, but yes, that 7-day quarantine in Australia will be a huge impediment to travel.
And just finally, once those borders do open though, what is the expectation on demand?
Demand will be very strong, and the fares are going to be really competitive. We're already seeing some great airfares out there. Qatar's got a fare sale on. Qantas has got some great fares into next year. So it's not going to be the crazy fares that we've seen in the past, because they need an incentive to get people to travel, and there's nothing like a good airfare.
Could be a few bargains around.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Geoff Thomas, appreciate you joining us as always. Thank you.
Pleasure.